The city where the tragic events took place is a small and quiet town in Oregon called Clayton. With a population of just over 15,000 people, Clayton has always been known for its quiet atmosphere and low crime rate. Last year, only 2 serious crimes were reported in the city. Local residents knew each other by sight, and any incident became a topic of discussion for many weeks. However, in the fall of 2009, this peaceful town became the focus of national attention due to the brutal murder of a young woman. Emily Johnson was an ordinary girl who had lived in Clayton since childhood. Her life proceeded as usual, working in a local cafe, chatting with friends, and rare trips outside the city. Friends described her as kind and sympathetic, always ready to help and support. Her life began to change about 2 years ago when she met Michael Stewart. Michael was 5 years older than Emily and worked for a small IT company developing software for local businesses. Unlike Emily, he was not a Clayton native. He moved here from the big city in search of peace and stability. Their acquaintance seemed casual, but quickly grew into a serious relationship. Emily and Michael often spent time together, and soon they began to be considered an inseparable couple. However, in recent months, something has begun to change. Emily's friends noticed that she smiled less often and often looked thoughtful and tired. Michael, on the contrary, became more withdrawn and irritable. No one knew what was going on inside their relationship, but it was obvious that everything was not as smooth as it seemed at first glance. In an interview, Detective Laura Gibson, who led the investigation, noted that the first warning signs appeared long before the tragedy. However, as often happens, no one attached any importance to them. It is quite possible that if someone around Emily or Michael had paid attention to these signs, the tragedy could have been avoided. During the first weeks after the breakup, the relationship between Michael and Emily continued to deteriorate. Emily tried to maintain a neutral relationship, but Michael was obsessed with winning her back at any cost. He began to exhibit obsessive behavior, sending her dozens of messages and constantly trying to meet her. His jealousy grew into obsession, and this behavior soon progressed to the stalking stage. Michael installed a spy app on Emily's phone, with which he could track her movements and read messages. He began spying on her meetings and even showed up at her house late one evening, trying to see who she was back with. All this was recorded by surveillance cameras, which later became important evidence in the case. Soon, Michael stopped hiding his intentions. Emily's friends recall how he openly threatened her several times if she did not return to him. However, despite this, Emily remained firm in her decision. She understood that the relationship with Michael could no longer continue, and her only desire was to start a new life. At this point, the situation began to rapidly deteriorate. Michael, realizing that he was losing control of the situation, began planning his final meeting with Emily. He decided that if he couldn't be with her, then no one else could. This decision was the beginning of the end for Emily and the starting point for one of the most notorious criminal cases in Clayton history. Michael and Emily's separation was a turning point that radically changed their lives. At the beginning of their relationship, no one could have imagined that it would end in such a tragedy. But, as often happens, cracks in the relationship began to appear gradually until they led to a final break. Emily hesitated for a long time before making the final decision to break up with Michael. She understood that their relationship had reached a dead end, and continuation would only worsen the situation. Michael was an introverted person, and although he initially seemed attentive and caring, over time his behavior began to take on signs of obsessiveness. He controlled Emily's every move and demanded constant reports from her about where and with whom she was spending time. At first, it seemed like a sign of concern, but soon grew into real paranoia. Emily tried to discuss problems in their relationship with Michael, but each time the conversations ended in quarrels. Michael refused to admit that his behavior was inappropriate. He sincerely believed that he was doing everything for her good. Ultimately, Emily realized that the only way out was to break up. The parting occurred in the cafe where they first met. Emily chose this place, hoping that Michael would not show aggression in a public place. She had prepared words in advance to gently but firmly explain her decision. However, Michael's reaction was unexpected. He listened to her silently, without interrupting, and then, without saying a word, he got up and left. This moment was the beginning of a new life for Emily, but for Michael, it was the beginning of the end. After the breakup, Michael withdrew into himself. He practically did not leave the house, missed work, and avoided meeting with friends. Thoughts constantly swirled in his head that Emily had made a mistake, that she had to come back. These thoughts became more and more obsessive, and soon Michael decided to act. Michael's first attempts to restore relations with Emily were desperate, but still within the limits of what was permissible. He called her, sent messages, came to her house with flowers, but Emily remained adamant. She knew that it was impossible to return everything back. However, Michael did not understand this. He perceived her refusal as a personal insult, as a betrayal. His obsession with getting Emily back has become an obsession. Things started to get worse when Michael started spying on Emily. He used modern technology to monitor her movements. By installing a spy app on her phone, he could track her location, read messages, and listen to conversations. It gave him a sense of control that he was so desperate to regain. One day, Michael found out that Emily had started dating another man. This was the last straw for him. The jealousy and anger that he had suppressed for so long burst out. He felt betrayed twice, first when she left him, and then when she found someone else. This thought completely destroyed his psyche. Michael stopped hiding his obsession. He began to follow Emily and her new boyfriend, threatening them both. He sent threatening messages, called in the middle of the night, blackmailed. All these actions were recorded, but the police, unfortunately, were unable to take action in time, believing that these were ordinary threats that would not lead to real action. Meanwhile, Emily tried to improve her life. She wanted to forget the past and move on, but Michael did not give her that opportunity. Constant threats and persecution began to take a toll on her mental state. She became nervous, avoided communication, and constantly looked over her shoulder, afraid to see Michael. Her friends advised her to contact the police, but Emily hoped that everything would somehow work itself out. She didn't know that Michael had already begun to develop a plan that would end everything once and for all. At this time, Detective Laura Gibson began to receive the first signals of a possible threat. Calls from Emily's friends and acquaintances began to arrive at the local police station. They talked about Michael's strange behavior and his obsessive actions, but the police did not have sufficient grounds to arrest or even question him. Everything seemed too insignificant to interfere. However, Detective Gibson decided to take a closer look at this situation. She understood that sometimes small details could indicate a coming disaster. She began collecting information about Michael, his past, his behavior in recent months. The more she learned, the more worried she became. However, despite her suspicions, she could not act without clear evidence. This omission cost Emily her life. After the breakup, Michael Stewart began to gradually plunge into the abyss of obsessive thoughts and jealousy. He no longer saw the point in his life without Emily. Despite the attempts of friends and colleagues to get him out of this state, Michael closed himself off, completely focused on one single goal: to return Emily at any cost. However, every day his behavior became more alarming and dangerous. Michael felt like he was losing control of the situation and decided to take matters into his own hands. He began to follow Emily using every means available to him. The first step was to hack her phone to monitor her messages and calls. Michael used his IT skills to install a spy app that allowed him to not only track her movements, but also listen to her conversations. This gave him a sense of false control and a sense of power over Emily. Michael did not just follow her movements. He carefully studied every little thing, every detail of her life. He knew when and where she went, who she met, what she said to her friends. He spent hours scrolling through her social media, tagging every new friend and every new photo. He was especially infuriated when he saw that Emily began communicating with another man. This revelation started a chain reaction in his mind, finally turning him into a stalker. Michael's next step was physical observation. He often waited outside her house, sitting in a car on a nearby street. He knew her work schedule, knew when she left and when she returned. He followed her when she was meeting friends, shopping, or just walking around the city. Her life became an open book for him, and each page of this book incited more and more jealousy and anger in him. One day, late in the evening, Michael saw Emily in the company of another man. They were returning home together after dinner at a local restaurant. Michael sat in the car nearby, watching them. His hands clenched the steering wheel until his knuckles turned white. He saw how Emily smiled at this man, how they talked and laughed. For Michael, it was a knife in the heart. He realized that it was all over for Emily, that she was truly moving on. This realization brought him to the edge. For several more days, Michael watched Emily, making sure that her new man had become important to her. He saw how they met more and more often, how she began to spend more time with him. Michael felt like he was losing her forever, and the thought was driving him crazy. The inner voice in his head was telling him that he had to do something, that he couldn't just let her go. This voice became louder and more aggressive, pushing him to radical action. Meanwhile, Emily began to notice that someone was following her. She told friends about strange calls, that she often sees the same car near her house. Her friends advised her to contact the police, but Emily did not want to believe that Michael was capable of something serious. She chalked it up to paranoia and decided it was best to just ignore him. However, Michael had no intention of stopping. He began to prepare for the next step. Every step he took was carefully thought out. Every step was aimed at causing maximum damage to Emily. He continued to watch her, studying every detail of her life, waiting for the right moment. His obsession grew into something darker and more dangerous. At this time, Detective Laura Gibson began to receive more and more alarming signals. Calls from Emily's concerned friends, reports of suspicious activity near her house. She began to realize that the situation went beyond ordinary persecution, that something more serious was brewing. But despite all her efforts, she still lacked enough evidence to take action. Michael, feeling that the police were beginning to take a closer look at him, became even more careful. He knew that time was running out, that he had to act quickly. A plan had already matured in his head, which he was going to implement in the coming days. By the time Michael realized that Emily was completely gone from his life, his mental state had become extremely unstable. His obsession turned into something much darker, a feeling of overwhelming jealousy and a desire to punish Emily for betraying him. At this point, Michael no longer saw any other choice but to put an end to everything that, in his opinion, had ruined his life. Michael began careful preparation for his crime. He understood that if he failed, his life would end in prison, and therefore everything had to be planned perfectly. The first step was purchasing a weapon. He purchased the gun illegally through an acquaintance, avoiding any official procedures so that his purchase could not be traced. Michael realized that this was not just a tool, it was a symbol of his last power over the situation, his last opportunity to control the course of events. Next, he began to plan the place and time of the attack. Michael knew Emily's daily routine down to the smallest detail, and this knowledge became his main weapon. He waited for the moment when Emily would be most vulnerable, when she would be alone. A few days before the tragedy, he watched her especially closely, noting every detail of her movements. He also thought through his escape route and ways to avoid capture immediately after the attack. Michael also took steps to disguise his actions. He changed his phone number, stopped using social networks, and began driving around the city in a rented car to avoid surveillance. He completely isolated himself from the outside world, focusing only on one goal: to kill Emily. His mental state continued to deteriorate. He increasingly heard an inner voice that pushed him to action, convinced him that this was the only way out. Michael barely slept, his thoughts spinning around the same idea. If Emily couldn't be with him, she wouldn't be with anyone. This voice became more and more intrusive until it finally drowned out everything else. Meanwhile, Emily, unaware of the danger, continued her life. She had no idea that Michael had already made a decision that would change her destiny forever. She tried to forget the past, trying to start a new chapter of her life, but a constant feeling of anxiety did not leave her. She noticed strange things, like unfamiliar cars near her house, or unknown numbers from which she was called. But she could not connect these events into a single whole, and could not foresee that her life would soon be in mortal danger. Detective Laura Gibson continued to investigate complaints from Emily's friends and neighbors. Her anxiety grew stronger every day, but the lack of concrete evidence prevented her from taking more active measures. She knew the situation was dangerous, but there was nothing yet that could directly indicate an impending murder. Michael, in turn, felt that time was running out. He realized that the police were beginning to suspect something, and that his behavior had not gone unnoticed. He needed to act quickly before he was arrested, or Emily was completely out of his reach. He already had a plan in his head that he intended to implement in the coming days. One evening, when Michael was at the peak of his rage and despair, he made his final decision. He chose the day and time to strike. This moment was the culmination of all his plans, all his fears and obsessions. He knew that after this there would be no turning back. The evening that Michael chose to carry out his plan turned out to be cool and calm. Emily had no idea that this day would be her last. She returned from work a little later than usual, planning to spend the evening at home watching a movie. But suddenly the call rang. Michael on the other end of the line seemed calm and balanced, which was not at all similar to his recent behavior. Michael suggested meeting to discuss their relationship and resolve any unresolved issues. He skillfully disguised his true intentions, radiating a false sense of calm and reconciliation. Emily, although cautious, decided that perhaps this meeting would help finally put an end to their relationship and perhaps give Michael the opportunity to move on. Despite her internal doubts, she agreed to the meeting. The meeting place was not chosen by Michael by chance. A small, sparsely populated park area on the outskirts of the city, where they often walked during their relationship. Michael knew in advance that at that hour it would be deserted, and they would be able to talk calmly. He also chose this location because of its proximity to his escape route, which he had planned in advance. When Emily arrived at the park, it was already getting dark. The atmosphere was oppressive, but she did not retreat. There was a glimmer of hope inside her that everything would go smoothly and they could part ways on a peaceful note. Michael, in turn, was extremely focused. In his car, parked nearby, there was a pistol, which he had prepared in advance. When they met, Michael suggested they go for a walk like old times. Emily noticed that he was strangely calm, but didn't think much of it. The conversation began with the usual things. Michael asked about her work, about her friends, tried to seem interested. However, the conversation soon turned to the topic of their relationship. Michael again began to accuse Emily of betrayal, of destroying everything they had. His voice became more and more aggressive, and his gaze became cold and cruel. Emily sensed danger and tried to interrupt the conversation, saying that she needed to leave. But Michael didn't let her do it. He began to accuse her of finding a new man, that she quickly forgot him and continued to live as if nothing had happened. These accusations turned into threats, and the threats turned into open displays of aggression. Michael, feeling that control was slipping away, snapped. He pulled out a gun and pointed it at Emily. She tried to calm him down, but it was too late. Michael was no longer able to hear her. There was only one thought running through his head. If she couldn't be with him, she wouldn't be with anyone. The situation got out of control. He pulled the trigger. A shot broke the silence of the park. Emily fell to the ground, her life ending in the blink of an eye. Michael froze for a second, realizing what had just happened. But the feeling of satisfaction from the completed plan quickly gave way to panic. He dropped the gun and hastily left the crime scene, moving along a pre-planned route. Everything was mixed up in his head: fear, panic, guilt. But he knew there was no turning back. Meanwhile, the park remained quiet and deserted. Emily lay on the ground, and her life could no longer be saved. Local residents heard the shots, but no one dared to go outside. Only sometime later, the police received the first call about suspicious sounds and a possible crime. Detective Laura Gibson, receiving a report of shots fired, immediately went to the crime scene. She already had a picture of what had happened in her head, but she hoped that all was not lost. However, upon arrival at the scene, she saw Emily's body and realized that her worst fears were confirmed. Immediately after the shot that shattered the silence of the park, Michael Stewart rushed away from the crime scene, leaving behind only a dark stain on the ground and the memories of what had once been his life with Emily. His actions were thoughtful, but at the same time chaotic. He knew that there might be traces at the crime scene, but panic took over, and he hastily left without bothering to remove the evidence. Michael got to his apartment and immediately began destroying all traces that could link him to the murder. He threw away his clothes and burned any potential evidence, including the phone he used to call Emily. There was only one question in his head: what's next? He knew it would take time for the police to put all the pieces together, But he also knew he had limited time. His plan, which seemed so perfect, began to crumble under the weight of reality. Meanwhile, Detective Laura Gibson was already at the crime scene. A team of criminologists, investigators, and experts began to gather around the park. The crime scene, illuminated by flashing lights, presented an eerie picture. Emily's body lay on the ground, her life cut short untimely. Laura, a seasoned detective with many years of experience, immediately realized that this crime was not a random act of violence. It was personal, thoughtful, and carried out by a person who knew Emily. First of all, Laura ordered the area to be cordoned off and thoroughly inspected. Forensic scientists began gathering clues: footprints on the ground, tire tracks that might have been left by the killer, fingerprints that might have been left on the weapon, and anything else that might lead to a clue. Laura knew that every detail mattered. She also ordered CCTV cameras installed around the park to check whether Michael was caught on tape. While forensic scientists worked at the crime scene, Laura began interviewing witnesses. The first thing she did was talk to local residents who heard the shot. No one saw the murder itself, but one witness mentioned seeing a car similar to the one Michael used to drive a few minutes before the shooting. Laura also learned that Emily had arrived at the park late in the evening, which in itself seemed strange given her recent complaints of harassment. At the same time, Laura sent a team to Michael's apartment to check his alibi. However, upon arrival, police discovered that Michael had disappeared. There was nothing suspicious in his apartment, but the fact that he ran away spoke for itself. An order for his arrest was soon issued, and all nearby police posts were alerted. Meanwhile, at the crime scene, Laura discovered another important piece of evidence: Emily's phone. It contains the latest messages and calls, including those from Michael. Having restored them, Laura realized that Emily had come to the park at Michael's request, which finally connected him with the murder. This was a key point in the investigation that allowed her to focus all her efforts on finding him. Michael, realizing that he would soon be found, tried to hide. He changed several cars, avoided surveillance cameras, and drove on less busy roads. But he knew that he couldn't run away forever. A voice grew louder and louder in his head, telling him that there was no way out. At some point, he began to think about giving up, but the fear of inevitable punishment stopped him. The investigation was gaining momentum. Laura and her team worked almost around the clock, checking all possible leads and collecting evidence. They contacted Emily's family and friends to understand how her relationship with Michael developed. Each new evidence only confirmed Michael's guilt, but finding him turned out to be more difficult than expected. Soon the police found the car in which Michael left the crime scene. The car was abandoned in the forest not far from the city. Forensic scientists began to study it, and there they found traces of blood and fingerprints that clearly linked Michael to the murder. This was the critical evidence that led to a warrant being issued for his arrest on a charge of first-degree murder. When police discovered Michael's car abandoned in the woods, it marked a key turn in the investigation. The machine provided Detective Laura Gibson and her team with compelling evidence linking Michael to Emily's murder. Traces of blood on the seats, fingerprints, gunpowder residues. All the evidence pointed to one thing: Michael committed a crime in a state of passion and tried to escape, but his attempts to evade justice began to crumble under the weight of the collected evidence. Michael was still at large, but his ability to hide became increasingly limited with each passing hour. The police spread his description and information about the crime throughout the state, and soon Michael found himself trapped. His face was all over the news channels and his name was on the lips of everyone in Clayton. He understood that he could no longer hide, and any further movement would only speed up his capture. Meanwhile, Detective Laura Gibson continued to coordinate the search operation. She understood that Michael might take extreme measures, including attempting suicide or attacking someone else. Laura ordered increased patrols on all roads leading out of the city and sent additional forces to areas where Michael might try to escape. Finally, 2 days after the murder, the police received an anonymous call about a suspicious man hiding in an abandoned house on the outskirts of the city. Laura immediately sent a rapid response team there. Arriving at the scene, they surrounded the house, making sure that Michael had no chance of escape. Laura personally took charge of the operation, realizing that the situation could quickly get out of control. When the police burst into the house, Michael was ready to be arrested. He understood that there was no turning back and did not resist. Laura personally handcuffed him, and looking into his eyes, she saw in front of her a man who was being eaten up from the inside by his own jealousy and hatred. Michael was silent, his face devoid of emotion, as if he had already accepted the fact that his life was over. Michael was immediately taken to the station, where he was interrogated. For several hours he was silent, not reacting to questions and not showing any emotion. However, faced with overwhelming evidence, including fingerprints and bloodstains, he finally admitted his guilt. Michael's confession was the culmination of the investigators' work, but for Laura, it was only the first step towards justice. The trial of Michael Stewart became a high-profile event, not only in Clayton, but also beyond. It attracted national attention, and every step of the process was thoroughly covered in the media. Lawyers tried to build a defense on Michael's unstable mental state, arguing that he acted under the influence of passion and did not realize the consequences of his actions. However, the prosecutor's office, armed with indisputable evidence, sought the maximum punishment. At the trial, witnesses, Emily's friends and relatives testified, describing what Michael was like before the breakup and how his behavior changed after. Detective Laura Gibson presented all the evidence collected at the crime scene, as well as CCTV footage and calls Michael made to Emily before the meeting. All this created an insurmountable wall of evidence against which defense lawyers had nothing to object. As a result, the court found Michael Stewart guilty of first-degree murder. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. This sentence was a well-deserved retribution for his crime, but could not bring Emily back to life, whose life was cruelly cut short due to someone else's jealousy and hatred. For Laura Gibson, the Michael Stewart case was an important lesson about how dangerous emotional outbursts that develop into manic obsession can be. She knew that such incidents would need to be monitored even more closely in the future to prevent similar tragedies. For a long time, the residents of Clayton could not recover from the shock that this murder caused. A city previously known for its peace and security has found itself in the spotlight because of one brutal crime. People began to reconsider their attitude towards others, towards possible signs of danger in the behavior of loved ones. However, the memory of the tragedy began to fade over time, giving way to new events and concerns. Thus ended the case of Michael Stewart, a man whose love turned into a deadly obsession, destroying not only Emily's life, but also his own. This incident became another reminder of how fragile the human psyche is and how important it is to recognize the signs of impending trouble in time.